Welcome to the New Year's Eve edition of Sovereign Submission. Today, I thought I would talk about a submission myth that I sometimes see put out there by people who don't really understand submission. And the submission myth is that a submissive doesn't have a voice. The idea being that, if someone submits, that they have given away their voice, they've given away their ability to have a conversation. Welcome, Brad. Glad to have you here. And I think this is a really important submission myth to debunk. Because if anything, being a submissive means that you have to actually really be in tune with your needs, your wants, and your desires and be able to speak them clearly. It doesn't mean that you're automatically going to get what you need, want, and desire from the person that you are submitting to. But if that person doesn't know what you need, want, and desire, they can't do anything about it. And it actually will significantly poison the relationship. Now, recently, I put together a hard conversations playbook, which I'm going to share down here below. I'm going to actually post a link to it here right now, but I'm going to share it in the show notes as well for people who watch this after the fact. And this is a really important thing because I find that a lot of men have trouble with speaking the hard conversations. A lot of men will not have the hard conversations. And I used to be one of those men. Um, in my second marriage, I did not have the hard conversations with my ex-wife that I needed to have. And I did it because I wanted to keep the peace. That was incidentally also a vanilla relationship. There was no real kink going on. Even though I liked kink a lot, I abandoned my desires and wants and needs in order to fit what I thought she wanted. I gave away a lot of my sovereignty because I wasn't willing to have the hard conversations. One of the hard conversations I needed to have with her was the fact that I was not monogamous. I didn't want to be monogamous. We'd gone into the relationship with the idea that we were going to be polyamorous. I had experience being polyamorous in the past. And then one day she was like, I can't do that. I'm too jealous. And there were other reasons as well. But it was one of those cases where suddenly that door was closed off. And it became something that ended up where what I ended up doing is instead of expressing cleanly and clearly to her what I wanted and the fact that I frankly needed to be polyamorous, that I was not a monogamous person, I ended up having an experience where what I did is I cheated on her. I ended up cheating on her with sex workers and stuff. I haven't really talked about that too much, but there it is. And it was one of those things where she never found out. But that doesn't change the reality that it happened. And it doesn't change the impact on her because I was doing something where where basically I was putting her into a situation where there wasn't consent involved. And it also doesn't change the fact that I carried a lot of shame and guilt for pretty much that entire marriage. And for a couple years after that, I don't anymore. I mean, I recognize that what I did was not right. I'm not absolving myself or anything, but I've done the work around it and I've taken steps to change who I am and I've moved forward from that. But one of the reasons I've done that is because I made a commitment to myself that I would have the hard conversations that otherwise I would avoid. Because when we avoid the hard conversations in our relationships and in our life, what we're essentially doing is setting ourselves up for failure in those relationships. And so I find the idea of like the submission myth to be really a really important one to debunk, because there's this idea that, if you are submissive, you're going to basically not speak up. Like, by the act of submissive, you're surrendering your voice, you're surrendering your autonomy, you're surrendering other things in order to submit. And for men, this can be a real challenge sometimes, because a male submissive, for one thing, a man who wants to submit may feel like a deep fear, like, oh, I'm surrendering my masculinity, I'm surrendering my presence, I'm surrendering other things if I submit, even though I want this. And there's nothing further from the truth than that. Now, Brad, since you're on here, if you have questions or comments, feel free to drop those in. I will respond to them, and anyone else who joins in here. But I think it's really important to recognize and acknowledge that, if anything, like, we need to be real with ourselves. And so when I'm a man who has chosen to surrender and submit to my mistress, what I'm really choosing is a very conscious, deliberate choice that I've made. I've made it in agreement with myself and with those deepest desires that I have. I've made it with her. And it involves a lot of conversation. Whether it's submission for the purpose of a scene or a 24/7 dynamic, there is a lot of conversation that needs to happen in order to make sure that each person feels like they are seen and heard and witnessed, that each person feels safe, that there is consent occurring. And I think sometimes, there's this modern narrative in men's work that, men are supposed to be dominant, men are supposed to lead, men are supposed to always be in charge. And I get it in some sense. Like, the idea that a man needs to lead himself is pretty important. Sometimes it can be, because when men, I've seen a lot of men out there who aren't leading themselves, who are basically in a situation where they're letting, where they're kind of like me. They were kind of like me a few years back, where I was not being honest and communicating and letting my desires and my shadows and everything else call all the shots. Welcome, Ray. Glad to have you here. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop those in. So, I think that it's really important to acknowledge and recognize that this can be a reality, that we can have a situation where there are a lot of men who maybe need to find some inner leadership from themselves. And here's the counterintuitive idea. The act of submission is actually an act of leadership on the part of a man when he chooses to surrender. A man who chooses to surrender and submit is actually leading himself into submission. Here's the thing. There's a saying: you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. It applies to this whole thing, like with DS dynamics and really just in relationships in general. You can't make somebody else submit. They have to agree or want to submit. And they basically have to choose if they're going to submit or not. And this is the thing that I think a lot of people misunderstand about submission. They think of it as, oh, well, submission, that person is weaker, that person is a simp, that person has given up their autonomy and their sovereignty. But if anything, it's like, I've stepped into my sovereignty more, and I've stepped into having conversations more because I've needed to. And if I don't have those conversations, if I don't step up and have that willingness to communicate, then something significant will go wrong at some point in that relationship, as I shared earlier. Welcome, Sheena. Glad to have you here. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's really important to understand that if you're a male submissive, you have a voice, and if anything, you have a responsibility to make sure that you are heard. And again, let me be very clear. It doesn't mean that you're going to get what you want all the time. Like, me saying, like, I want this doesn't automatically mean I'm going to get it. But if my mistress doesn't know what I want, she can't do anything about it. And she can't read my mind. If I expect her to read my mind, I'm actually putting a lot of pressure on her. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a covert contract. That's nice guy behavior at that point. If you're not familiar with nice guy stuff, there's a book that came out some years ago by Robert Glover called "No More Mr. Nice Guy" that kind of speaks to that. I do work with men around nice guy behaviors. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I've come up with the the hard conversations playbook, because it's really about teaching men how to develop the scripts they need to have sometimes to have the hard conversations. I mean, one of the challenges that I found is that I would go into a conversation and I would start to feel activated physiologically. My heart rate would speed up, my my face would flush, and I would just feel my biology start working up, and I would be like, "Oh, I can't have this conversation, like it's too hard." So I would stay silent. The problem is that I was in a stew of misery and silence in that silence. And if you're a man who has, or a woman who's had that experience, who's stayed silent for the sake of keeping the peace, for settling for less, you know what the cost is for that. At some point, the cost is the relationship itself. The cost is your integrity. The cost is your self-respect. A submissive man is a man who is fully in touch with his respect. He's fully in touch with his self-trust. He's fully in touch with his sovereignty and his awareness, and he brings that into the relationship. He's actually the safest kind of man there could possibly be, because he's actually going to speak up and share what's on his heart and what's on his mind. And it's not easy. I had a hard conversation with my mistress about a week and a half back, where I shared something that I was like, this is something I want. And it wasn't an easy conversation. It was a hard conversation for both of us. And yet we came out the other side. We came out the other side okay. I think one of the criteria that is often missing and isn't spoken to as much as it needs to be is that the point of having a hard conversation is that it actually leads us deeper into the intimacy and connection and contact that we want to have with the people that we are involved with. That doesn't mean it's easy in the moment, because I can share what I want, but I don't control her. And that's one of the things that I think can be so hard for like someone, not just the submissive, someone who's a submissive. I mean, this is true for just anyone in general. Okay. But we're going to use this dynamic here. That's what can be so hard in that moment. Cause it's like, okay, I've shared something I want. I don't control this other person. And if we're being real, this other person doesn't control me. We may be playing a game where she is my mistress and I'm agreeing to do what she says, but I'm agreeing to do what she says. I'm consenting to do what she says. I'm making that choice. She can't make me do it. And if I decide that I don't want to do it, then that may break the dynamic, but there it is. I have chosen not to do it. That's the thing that I think a lot of people misunderstand about submission. And this whole point of communication is so important. So coming back to the hard conversation piece of it, it's can we come out the other side of that conversation still being in contact with each other? So I can share something that I want, and she's going to have her own response to it, and I don't get to control that response. I don't get to be the one in charge of that. That's her thing to be in charge of. But guess what? I also don't need to feel guilty for it either. This is another area where men struggle sometimes, where it's like, oh, I feel guilty. Like if I bring this up, I'm going to upset her, and then I feel guilty for upsetting her, so I shouldn't say anything. You not saying anything is actually much, much worse, because it's going to hurt that relationship far more. Your ability to say something and speak up and have the hard conversation, as hard as it may be, is absolutely one of the most important skills that you can cultivate. And it's not easy. Because going into a hard conversation, it's like, well, what am I going to say? You start to strategize. I mean, I've started to strategize. Like, if I say it this way, maybe it won't. And at some point, you just have to have the conversation. It was kind of interesting because the hard conversation that I had with my mistress, we were talking and it was late at night. And I was, you know, she was calling me in about some stuff about some regret about that I had in regards to the previous to my marriage, actually, my former marriage. And that's what actually prompted me to have the hard conversation. And it was funny because it was like, well, it's like any strategy I had went right out the window in that moment. It's just like, no, I'm gonna just say this. I'm gonna say this because I'm ready to say it. And I did. And again, it wasn't an easy conversation, but it was liberating. It was liberating for me. It may or may not have been liberating for her. I can't speak to that. But it was liberating for me. And I'm glad that I had it. And I think that we did come out the other side. It seems like we came out the other side in contact with each other with more intimacy and connection because that conversation was had. Whereas if I hadn't had it, it would have been a tension between us. She would have known it was there. We've gotten to know each other pretty well by now that we both know when there's something there on either side of the equation. And that's the cost of not having the hard conversations. It's like if you know that there's something there and you're not willing to have it or say it or speak it, that conversation is going to define your relationship. It's going to define it in so many ways. So one of the things I really recommend doing is recognizing and learning that, first of all, if you are a man, whether you identify as submissive or not, it's important to have the hard conversations that you've been avoiding having. And if you need help with that, I do have the playbook. I'm going to put it in the chat box here right now for the live, and it will be in the show notes here as well if you want to grab that. But the other thing that I really want you to know and come away with is that hard conversations only define the relationship until they're had. And then at that point, they open the relationship up for discovery. As long as I don't have the hard conversation, that's what's defining the relationship. And it's going to define every single interaction. It's going to define your actions. It's going to define what you do or don't do. And as I shared at the beginning of this, you know that can come out in many different ways and not always in the best way. So remember that. But if you choose to have the conversation, if you choose to speak up for something that's on your heart and your mind, and it's not always even about something that you want, need, or desire. Maybe it's something that's just bothering you. Maybe you're upset about something. If you're willing to have that conversation, that is going to transform the relationship dynamic right there. And it's just going to bring you in deeper. And I will say this as well, in closing, before I wrap up here. There's also something to be said for having agreements about when those hard conversations happen. One thing that my mistress and I agreed on is that, conversations late at night, right before bed, are probably not the best time to have those hard conversations. In fact, they're not. It can be a bit dysregulating, and that was what it was, for her. And I acknowledged that. I recognized it. I mean, part of it was in the moment, like I kind of like in the moment, it was like she popped the balloon and out everything came. And that doesn't change the fact that moving forward with awareness that I can be like, okay, I have something I need to bring up with her. And I'm going to bring it up in the morning when she's more resourced, available, and present for that. And what I could do at the same time is say, hey, there is something I need to speak with you about. I'm going to bring it up tomorrow or something along, or I can just hold my counsel and say, okay, I'm not going to say it right now, but I'll bring it up tomorrow. We can do that. This is an important part of having those hard conversations is also having the agreements around those conversations. When does this happen? What can we do to support each other and everything else? And to recognize too that sometimes the hardness that we think the conversation will will be in the conversation won't necessarily be there. It may not be as hard as you think it will be. Sometimes it might be. A lot of times, the reason we think a conversation is harder than it actually is because we're busy having an argument with the projection of the person that we're going to have that conversation with. And don't get me wrong, sometimes it is that hard. Sometimes it isn't. So, thank you all for being here live. I hope that you have a safe and happy New Year's. And remember that you can do this. And if you need help with having hard conversations, get my Hard Conversations playbook. It's a great way to start learning how to have those conversations and empower yourself. And I will also share that later in January, I am going to be doing a class around this called Speak So She Can Feel You, which is really just about giving men the tools and training to go deeper into these conversations. I'm going to share that below as well here. But if you're like, oh, hey, that is something that I think I could really use, or that's something that interests me, I'm going to encourage you to check that out. So I'm going to also put that into the chat here real quick. And thank you all for being here. Take care of yourselves and have a wonderful and safe New Year's.